Good morning, everyone, and welcome to QSA Talks Online. My name is Alicia Ray, and I'm the Public Programs Officer here at Queensland State Archives. We're proud to have Lesley Synge present to you today Ructions and Resilience, a family crisis and Meteor Park Orphanage, Neerkol. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are filming today, and that is the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. A warm welcome to our special guest today, Lesley Synge. Lesley was born in Brisbane and holds a Master's in Creative Writing from the University of Queensland. She is published in many genres, including social history, fiction, and poetry. Her prize-winning essay, Ructions and Resilience, was inspired by a 1916 case file that mentions 4 children, Lesley's great aunts and uncles. It won the 2018 Arts Central Queensland Lorna MacDonald Essay Prize. In this QSA talk, Lesley will discuss writing techniques that can bring archives to life as she explores the tussle over the children, highlighting the vulnerability of young people caught between church and state in the early 20th century. Thank you very much for joining us, Lesley.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you to the Queensland State Archives for having me speak to you today. I also acknowledge country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, especially so because this particular orphanage has become more notorious in later years as a place where many of the stolen generation were living. I also thank the Lorna MacDonald Essay Prize collaboration with Arts Central Queensland for inspiring me to get going and bring these files to life in the form of a 5,000-word essay. Now, one of the techniques that I think is really important for any writer, and I hope I've managed to do this, is to try and lift the characters that you read in the files into life and make them shine, make them sparkle, make them really live, because they are just names on a page. So in this particular case, I looked at who were the main players, and certainly it was the mother of the children, including my grandmother, the father of the children, Philip, the nun who was looking after the children, or at least was the head of the orphanage in Neerkol, and the State Children's Department man, Patterson. There was also a miner who played a minor role, and I think another important player is actually not a person, but the money. You'll hear the words 6 shillings and 6pence come up quite a bit. That's how much it cost to keep each child per week. In today's terms, that's about $200. And I think you'll find that really the whole drama revolves around the money. Besides bringing the characters to life, I think it's really important to interact with the documents, make photocopies of them, and then really engage with them. Use a highlighter to highlight what's really important. Don't get bogged down in all of the detail. Try and find what makes this a story that's going to be interesting to a modern audience. And that modern audience might just be your family, but it's still a modern audience and they need a story. The other major suggestion I'd make is add extras. So while the State Archives file about the state children in that particular orphanage is the major part of this essay, I added another file, and that is a file about Philip O'Keefe, which I found here in the Queensland State Archives. I also added a little bit of a letter that came to me from a family member, a little bit of local Ravenswood history where the story actually began, and of course, registry documents, births, deaths and marriages never fail. The fourth thing I would mention is to find the drama. Again, this relates to story. Find the drama that is here. What are the bones of this story, and highlight those. Let the rest fall away. That's what really counts, the story. There's an optional extra, and that is you can insert yourself into the story if you want to. I chose to do that. I give an example at the very beginning, but I have in general for today's discussion, cut out a lot of those extra things about myself and how I viewed the story, just for time reasons. But I encourage you to consider putting yourself into the story. That also brings that story into the present day and makes it more engaging for, contemporary readers. So I hope I've achieved getting those techniques right. I think they always can be perfected, but I'll start now with reading my paper, Ructions and Resilience. In North Queensland, Mrs. O'Keefe, born 1882, and her 5 children were spending their last Christmas in the gold mining town of Ravenswood. As the year came to a close, she was envisaging, it seems, improved prospects south in Central Queensland. She planned her move, including lining up a job as a cook in Mount Morgan and putting her children into the care of St Joseph's Sisters of Mercy near Rockhampton as a stopgap measure until properly settled. Elizabeth Jane O'Keefe, or Lizzie, 33, must have caught the branch line to Townsville, where, according to family memory, she ushered her brood onto the Canberra, a coastal steamer. The oldest was my grandmother, Mary Ellen, known as Molly. All Molly would say about her father was, "Me father was a shocker, a terrible drunk. There were always ructions, and he died out west working for the railways." The order of those events seemed to be a railway accident that devastated the family and caused them to move to Mount Morgan to start over. The truth, in a correspondence file compiled by the State Children's Department, is rather more complex than that. My mother, Lizzie's first grandchild, was a schoolteacher and married my schoolteacher father in Gladstone. There were 3 daughters. My mother and her mother were close, and school holidays invariably involved catching a train to Rockhampton and another train up the Razorback Mountains to Mount Morgan. Molly's siblings, like us, visited often, and they consolidated my love affair with the old town. They were my great uncles and aunts, and I knew them as Auntie Flo and Auntie Pearl, Uncle Frank and Uncle George. I knew their homes, their good-natured, family-centred generosity, their spouses and their families. We were all family. I had no insight then into their childhoods and the resilience that they'd had to foster. Meteor Park Orphanage, later known as Neerkol Orphanage after the location, until it closed in 1972, was a large property, 4,000 acres, had a dairy, cattle yards, piggery, chooks, as you can imagine. Vegetables were grown, there was a convent, a chapel, a bakery, a kitchen, dining room, 3 dorms, a nursery and a school for the children. The superintendent or sister in charge was Sister Cecilia Ludgate. You can see on your screen what Neerkol looks like now, a deserted place. It was closed in 1972. But I imagine that driveway in looked fairly similar, even back in 1916. A pretty isolated place, self-sufficient. During the years of the Great War, Mount Morgan's copper mine was flourishing, but the Ravenswood gold mine had closed. Many men enlisted and others left to mine elsewhere. One of the workers who left was Philip O'Keefe, born 1864 in the village of Knock in County Clare, Ireland. Now, Philip was some 18 years older than Lizzie, but in fact, he was very much alive, though not in town. They had 5 children, then he suddenly disappeared. Millie Dennis, a niece of Lizzie's in North Queensland, wrote to me in 1998. Whether Lizzie left Ravenswood with the help of anyone else is not known, but she did arrive in Rockhampton in late January 1916 and took her 4 youngest to the orphanage. She kept only Molly, my grandmother, with her. She was 12. And then my great-grandmother started work at the Imperial Hotel in Mount Morgan as a cook. Frank, 11, Florence, 9, Elizabeth, known as Pearl, 8, and George, only 5, stayed with the care of the Sisters of Mercy. The State Children's Department file begins 5 weeks after the arrival of the 4 children at that orphanage, when in one of Sister Cecilia's frequent pen and ink dispatches to Mr. Patterson, the Inspector of State Children of the District Office of Rockhampton, she asks about them. The orphanage was licensed under the State Children's Act of 1911 and enjoyed close cooperation with the State Government Office. It is possible that Lizzie O'Keefe, knowing from past experience that there was little hope that their father would provide for them, was counting on the orphanage to keep them as an act of charity. However, that was not the way things worked, as she was about to find out. Sister Cecilia's immediate concern was to pin down the funds needed for their upkeep. In the absence of provident parents, the government stepped in, but that necessitated a process. First, it had to turn the children into state children. On the 6th of March 1916, the nun applied her neat and stylish penmanship to the matter. We have 4 children here named O'Keefe. The mother wanted to go to work, and she told me the forms, that would have been the undertaking form that parents needed to sign to commit their children and to commit to the upkeep of their children in an orphanage. These forms had been sent to the father of the children, Philip O'Keefe of Ballala, near Cloncurry, to sign. And I told her they may not be admitted as state children until the forms were completed. Have you heard anything about them? Now, the Rockhampton office typed its dispatches and soon sent Sister Cecilia a memo asking her to forward the addresses of the parents. Philip may have suddenly disappeared as far as the extended family in Ravenswood was concerned, but Lizzie O'Keefe knew exactly where he was. He was near Cloncurry, west of Townsville, on a copperfield. Sister Cecilia passed on his address, as well as that of Lizzie's, care of the Imperial Hotel, Mount Morgan. Mrs. O'Keefe received her first memo, dated the 10th of March, from the State Children's Office in Rockhampton, with an undertaking form enclosed. In part, it states, each state child costs this department the sum of 6 and 6, remember that is $200 approximately in today's money, per week. Have you heard anything further from the father of the children? On the 11th of March, Sister Cecilia again wrote to the office. She wanted to place the children on the department's weekly return in order to collect that 6 shillings and 6pence payment that the government would provide for each of them. From her point of view, either the parents or the state government was accruing a weekly debt of £2, 2 shillings, to the orphanage. The children had been in the care of the Sisters of Mercy for less than 2 months when a second memo, dated the 18th of March, arrived at the Imperial Hotel. Mrs. O'Keefe should sign the undertaking form and heed this warning. If we do not receive a reply from you in the near future, we will be compelled to treat the children as neglected children. A clearly panicked and indignant Lizzie put pen and ink to 2 pages torn from a notebook and wrote to the head sister of the orphanage. Well, sister, as I started to cook at the Imperial Hotel for the £2 a week, I only stood it for 2 days. I'm still in the kitchen, but only get £1, as I was not able to stand the hard work. Well, sister, I'm going to look around this week for a small house, and I will take the children from your hands and will try and battle for them myself. Hoping this scribble finds you and all of the children quite well, as it leaves me at present broken-hearted. I remain yours truly, Mrs. O'Keefe. Still no support for the children, Sister Celia wrote on the 4th of April. The office could only reiterate in turn that it would not allow their names to be entered on the weekly return until it could hear from the mother. It then sent a 4th memo to the Imperial Hotel. Lizzie replied on the same day, the 5th of April, 1916. Despite numerous ink blots, she sent it to the district office. About the children, I'm not in a position to sign those papers you sent me, as I'm only getting £1 a week, and out of that I have to keep myself and also the other girl, Molly, at the college, and it takes something to keep her going at that school with books. The only thing I can do is this, to buy them some clothes as often as I can, and then try and get a small house and get them with me. I could take in washing then and try and keep them that way. Did you hear from their father? I think it is hard that he is to be let off, and I have been the mother to those darling children. One mother in 100 has not done the same for their children as I have done. But it is no use talking. I only hope God will reward me. So I figured that Philip, from a little more that she writes as well, that Philip was not only a poor provider, but she seems to have subsidised his business as well and wiped out her savings. She continues, I could not sign those papers as I might get out of work and I could never pay up, for as you know as well as I do, a woman don't get much for the work she does. Yours truly, Lizzie O'Keefe. Inspector Patterson himself now took over the management of the case. He sent a memo out to Philip O'Keefe in Cloncurry with an undertaking form enclosure. I rather like the more stiff and formal language that he uses. We have the honour to inform you that there are at Meteor Park Orphanage, Neerkol, 4 children named O'Keefe, who we understand are yours. The sister in charge of the orphanage has written to us seeking permission that they be made state children, but in order that this may be done, we must have the attached forms 1 and 13 completed in the presence of the JP. Please attend to this matter. Each child at Meteor Park costs this department 6 shillings and 6pence a week. With her orphanage plan going badly awry, Lizzie at last managed to visit the Rockhampton office in person, and she spoke to Inspector Patterson on the 26th of April. It must have been quite a meeting. Even through the papers of the files, you can see that there were confessions, confidences and tears as she completed the forms asked of her. Firstly, the application to make the 4 children in the orphanage state children, and secondly, to pay 5 shillings a week beginning immediately. The signature on these forms is Miss Elizabeth Dennis. Lizzie had revealed that Philip had never married her. Obviously, Inspector Patterson insisted that she sign as the spinster she technically was. Mrs. Lizzie O'Keefe, was no more. After Lizzie left, the complexity of the case saw Mr. Patterson composing a letter to head office to go with the forms. I won't read it all, but here's where it mentions the father. So this is to head office about Philip O'Keefe. The children have to me been registered wrongly, and this fact would be revealed if a police report were asked for. And same would probably result in the prosecution of the father for the incorrect registration of the births of the children. I mentioned the matter to Miss Dennis, and she stated that, for the sake of the children, she would not like anything like that to happen. The children are entirely ignorant of their mothers being unmarried, and their mother wept when asking not to have him prosecuted for the wrongful registration of their births. She could not keep, that means support the children, if she had them. I think it would be preferable for the department to take them. From a humanitarian standpoint, I am not asking for a police report into the wrongful registration of their births. but I am recommending their admission as state children as soon as possible. A first instalment of maintenance has been paid. Now, Lizzie did something else that day. She went to the Methodist parsonage in Campbell Street, Rockhampton, and got married. Now, when my distant unmarried relation, Millie Dennis, wrote to me from North Queensland in 1998, she said that Philip O'Keefe suddenly disappeared. Lizzie left Ravenswood for Mount Morgan, and a brother on her mother's side of the family, a man called Will Hancock, followed her. Will Hancock, born in 1875, was a miner, aged 38, from a family of emigrant Cornish miners who had initially worked in Copperfield near present-day Clermont. When that field ran out, the family moved to Ravenswood to mine gold. Now, Will must have been acquainted with Lizzie Dennis O'Keefe, since his sister was actually married to Lizzie's brother, John Dennis. There are few secrets in small mining towns, and Will must have known that life with the Irishman was tough. He may have observed family violence at first hand, but that is impossible to know. With O'Keefe suddenly disappeared to Cloncurry, he may well have decided then to plan a future with Lizzie. My distant relation reported to me, Uncle Will became interested in Elizabeth, much to the disappointment of his mother. Now, that a man from Ravenswood would find work with Mount Morgan mine was not at all unusual, but that he would marry a woman with 5 children while their father was still alive probably was. Whatever the mutual understanding and communications between himself and his intended, Will Hancock must have known the children were in the orphanage when he married her on the 26th of April 1916. But Sister Cecilia, of course, was none the wiser. She actually wrote to Inspector Patterson a few days later and again raised the issue of money. In his terse memo of reply, Patterson disclosed nothing of Lizzie's past. He simply advised that the matter was in the hands of head office. When Sister Cecilia took up her pen the following week, it was to report a significant development. On Saturday, the mother had visited and she had taken one of the children. Since the children were not yet state children, the nun wrote that she had to comply with her wishes. The office promptly assured her in a memo that it was quite in order for her to do so. Lizzie, unaware of the swift channel of communication between the orphanage and the Rockhampton office, wrote her own tell-all version to Inspector Patterson. In her typically unpunctuated script, she let her words lope across the page in an innocent way, as if she was not revealing bombshells. Patterson read, pen in hand, and astutely underlined one passage in blue ink. I'll highlight it shortly. Lizzie writes, I was out to see the children on Saturday and one of them had been sick and looked just so wretched I brought her back with me, the little girl called Pearlie. I could not leave her behind. I think it would be best for me to take the other 3 out and I will look after them as I married a man called Hancock in Rockhampton. Truly, yours truly, Lizzie Hancock, small cross, Mrs. O'Keefe. Coolly, Patterson sent a memo on the 11th of May to Mrs. Elizabeth Hancock, making certain requests of the new husband. On receipt of William Hancock's letter to the office, Patterson again took up his pen and underlined a particular phrase. Will Hancock had written, I'm willing to receive and also to care for the children from this date on. Patterson realised he was dealing with an application for the discharge of the 3 remaining children, and he asked the Mount Morgan Police to go to their home and investigate whether it was a suitable place. Meanwhile, down in Brisbane and head office, the paperwork asking for the children to become state children had arrived, and it was approved. So Patterson then had to send a memo to Sister Cecilia appraising her, but adding that the mother had lodged an application for their discharge on account of having married a man named Hancock. This was probably the first the head nun had heard of that. Obviously relieved that she could add them to her weekly report and collect the 6 shillings 6pence for each of them, she replied, "If the mother comes for the children, I have your letter to show that she cannot take them without your authority." Meanwhile, the police report came to the office, and Inspector Patterson applied his pen to it too. Mrs. Hancock has recently been married, said the police officer, and is living in a 6-roomed house in Central Street, Mount Morgan. Her husband is employed at Mount Morgan Mine and is receiving 10 shillings and 4pence a day. He's in constant employment. Mrs. Hancock and her husband bear a good character. The house in which she lives is comfortable and exceptionally clean and tidy, and also the children she now has with her, Molly and Pearl, that is. What he underlined was Mrs. Hancock and her husband bear a good character, and the house in which she lives is exceptionally clean and tidy. Well, all's going well, but now Philip O'Keefe enters the fray from Cloncurry. It's the next item in the file. You can actually hear the Irish brogue in his letter. He writes to the head office, Mr. Patterson. They, the children, are there without my consent and without the slightest knowledge of my part that the mother intended taking them there. She and they always had a happy home, with every want supplied by us while living in Ravenswood. And the first knowledge that I had of breaking up the house was when I saw them on a train, bound to some destination unknown to us at the time. My love for the children compels me to ask that they be kept at the orphanage until December, when I shall visit and make arrangements for their welfare. I will send the requisite amount each month. They must be kept free of any control of the mother. I've heard of Meteor Park, and I know that under the care of the good sisters, the children's lot could not be in a better position. The office acknowledged receipt and advised him somewhat stiffly, with a bit of legalese thrown in. Their mother lodged an application for the discharge of the children from state control on the 8th instant. Inquiries have been made into the circumstances connected therewith, and all papers, including your letter herein, are being submitted to head office, where the question will be eventually decided by the minister. Discreet and thorough as usual, Inspector Patterson composed a fresh recommendation to head office in Brisbane. In brief, her husband Hancock wrote to this office signifying his willingness to take care of the children in the future. And if O'Keefe is so much concerned about the children, it is somewhat strange that he did not marry their mother long ago instead of merely cohabitating with her. As for the children, I do not think their future should be jeopardised in any way. Therefore, I shall recommend her application for favourable consideration. The acting director wrote back. In a handwritten note, he added, being illegitimate, the putative father has no legal claim on his illegitimate children, and stamped the application for discharge from state control approved. None the wiser about Mr. Patterson's advocacy or Philip O'Keefe's demands, Mrs. Lizzie Hancock received a final memo dated the 9th of June telling her that the 3 remaining children in the orphanage were released from state control, and that the sister in charge will hand over the little ones to your care. So discharge forms, and you see an example on the screen, for those 3 children were actually signed by Sister Cecilia on the 11th of June, 1916. And these are the last papers in the file. The newly formed family could begin their version of living happily ever after. The union of Lizzie and Will Hancock, there they are in, I think, about the late 40s, so long after this particular drama of 1916. But their union did result in 3 children of their own, who I knew too. So in all, Will raised 8 children on his wage as a miner at Mount Morgan. According to my distant relation in North Queensland, his mother in Ravenswood went to her grave without forgiving him. So the family survived the Spanish flu epidemic of 1919, the ups and downs of the mine, whether it was fires, floods, closures, strikes, and by all accounts, when William Hancock died in 1953, he was a man at peace with himself. I never had the pleasure of knowing him, but his kindness, sobriety, and reliability lived on in Molly's siblings and stepbrother and sisters. He must have fallen deeply in love with Lizzie in Ravenswood, and I hope he never felt regret at the rescue of her 5 children. Now, my mother was born in 1924, the first of Lizzie's grandchildren. Earlier that year, on the 27th of May, Philip O'Keefe died in the Longreach Hospital after fracturing his thigh in an accident and developing pneumonia. He was 59 and working at the time for Queensland Railways, perhaps doing fencing and other forms of manual labour. He was not an official employee. The task of finalising his affairs fell to the public curator. So guess what file ended up here in the Queensland State Archives? His interstice file reveals a man with almost nothing, besides basic items of clothing, a swag, a razor strap, a mosquito net, and so on. Cash in the bank amounted to 5 shillings and 11 pence. His gun and gold ring were sold to cover the cost of administering his affairs. Although no liquor was itemised in his possession, there is every indication of a man whose drinking problem had condemned him to a poor and lonely life. He said his status was single. He said, well, it said on the death certificate that his only kin were parents, address unknown. His mates pitched in to pay for the funeral. On a scrap of paper in the long buried and yellowed file was an address I recognised. It says Mrs. W.E. Hancock, spelt wrongly, Central Street, Mount Morgan. I offer no explanation as to why that address is in there, but it's interesting that it was. Behind my grandmother Molly's taciturn summation of the tumultuous year of 1916 for that family, that is, that they had a terrible drunk of a father who died out west, there really lay quite a story. There's a couple of PSs to my essay. Quite recently, my second cousin, who actually unearthed this file, Marie Fisher of Rockhampton, she unearthed the State Children's file. She located his unmarked grave in Longreach. And that's it. Rest in peace, poor old Philip O'Keefe, my great-grandfather. There's another PS I'd like to add. The orphanage closed in 1972. It became the subject of many inquiries into institutional child abuse. And this is a picture of the memorial erected to acknowledge the suffering of the children who spent time in that orphanage. The story of my great-uncles and aunts is a pretty happy one, all considered. There are many very sad stories, I believe, buried away in these files. My heart goes out to all who have suffered there. I'm sorry that's a sad note that I'm ending on, but perhaps I'll end on that note that in my family's case it all ended well. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to the Queensland State Archives for inviting me to present today.
Thank you, Lesley. We do have a couple of questions from the audience. First of all, how have your family reacted to the essay and the research? Did you consult with them at all?
I didn't consult with them. As I said, one of my second cousin provided the file that really inspired the essay. But, I mean, I entered this into a competition, so, you know, I didn't consult with anybody. I guess you're asking that question because there could be some sensitivity about discovering something like a cover-up in the family, and also that concept of, you know, that it's embarrassing to have ancestors who didn't have, you know, as a copybook style idea of marriage, etc. Well, all the players are long dead. My great-grandmother, all of the aunts and uncles mentioned and who are, you know, pictured in that beautiful photograph, which is at the beginning of the talk. So I didn't have to worry about their sensibilities. And in any case, I'm a writer, so my philosophy of writing is that I tell the truth. I tell the story that I think is useful to our society. I don't actually worry too much about whether it's going to ruffle a few feathers. That might seem a little callous, but that is my philosophy about what I write. Thank you for that question.
So we've got another question here. Where do you start with doing family history at the archives, and what sort of records do you look for?
Right, well, I can't answer that question because I am not in general looking at my whole family history. I have many projects as a writer, and it just so happened that I decided I'd bring this file to life. So I don't really have much to say about that, and I know on the website there's plenty of information that will help you to start your journey in family history, and I can only wish you very well with that and say that they're very helpful here at State Archives and in many other places too.
I think that was all the questions that we had from the audience today. So I'll just say a big thank you, Lesley. It was an absolute pleasure to have you with us today at QSA and share your family history. It's quite timely considering it is National Family History Month in August as well. Thank you to those who have been watching. We do look forward to bringing you another QSA talk online very soon.